The family. Imagine growing up in a house where every rule comes from God, every punishment comes from mom, and mom is the same person who tells you she is Jesus Christ. In 1960s Melbourne, when a yoga teacher named Anne Hamilton Byrne decided that instead of just teaching the lotus position, she would simply become God. She began handpicking her first devotees. Anne set her sights on Melbourne's professional elite, and by the early 1970s, Anne had 20 people eating out of her hand. To lock them in, she sold them a two-part cocktail of lies. First, she convinced them that she was the literal reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Then, she added a deadline. The world was ending very soon, and she was the only one capable of raising a master race of children to rebuild humanity from the rubble. To fulfill the prophecy, some members handed over their own biological kids, while others used their jobs at hospitals to set up illegal adoptions. Two doctors in the group even faked birth certificates so the paperwork would show that Anne was the real mother. Between the late 1960s and early 1980s, she acquired at least 14 children this way, though some counts later reached 28. Anne stashed them at a secluded compound near Lake Eildon. Inside the compound, Anne erased their identities first. She bleached all their hair blonde, forced them into identical outfits, and gave them new names to remove any trace of who they were before. She cut them off from the outside world completely. Their education consisted entirely of whatever version of the world Anne chose to manufacture that day. Anne locked those children in dark rooms for days to enforce discipline. She beat them with leather belts for the slightest mistake, and starved them into submission. When fear alone wasn't enough, she introduced LSD. She told followers the drug destroyed ego and accelerated spiritual truth. She supervised the sessions herself, giving the drug to children who were still preteens. While they were completely scrambled and disoriented, she reinforced her authority. This system held for nearly 20 years. In 1987, a former member called the police. It led to a 1988 raid that removed the remaining children from the property and caused the group to fall apart. Anne fled to the United States, but was caught in 1993 and extradited back to Australia to face a legal system that proved to be the final insult. In 2001, she only pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud regarding the falsified adoption documents. The court fined her 5,000 Australian dollars. She received no conviction for child abuse and never spent a single day behind bars. Anne Hamilton Byrne eventually lost her mind to dementia and died in aged care in 2019 at the age of 98. Children of God. In 1968, the beaches of Huntington Beach, California were a magnet for teenagers who had walked away from their parents, their churches, and the Vietnam War. They were sleeping in cars and couch surfing, looking for anything that didn't feel like the rotten society they had left behind. A former pastor named David Berg began collecting these kids off the sand, telling them they weren't dropouts, but a chosen final generation. He promised them a radical new way of living, and dozens of them listened because they had nowhere else to land. By 1969, the group moved into an abandoned clinic in Texas to live as a full-time commune. At first, it looked like a passionate Christian community where members pooled their money and shared their homes. Berg soon rebranded the movement as the Children of God. He started calling himself Moses David, or Mo. As the group grew into the hundreds, the freedom of the beach disappeared, replaced by the Mo letters. These were mandatory written directives that controlled every detail of a member's life, from where they lived to who they were allowed to marry. Soon after, Berg introduced flirty fishing. He ordered the women in the group to use sex to lure in new male members and donations. He called this missionary work, but the cult leaders tracked the results with the cold efficiency of a sales team. Any woman who refused to participate was subjected to public shaming and physical abuse until she complied. Eventually, Berg's doctrine took its darkest turn when he began writing that physical contact between adults and children was divine and harmless. Adults followed his words as they always did. This systemic abuse eventually reached the ears of the law. By the mid-1970s, outraged parents began reporting that their children had been brainwashed and stolen. That led the New York Attorney General to officially label the group a cult in 1974. When more members escaped and spoke to authorities about kidnapping and incest, the FBI and Interpol launched international manhunts for Berg. To evade capture, Berg went underground and moved the group's headquarters to Europe, turning his children into a global ghost network. By the 1980s, the group had spread to over 70 countries, with 12,000 members living in 1,400 communal homes worldwide. Berg spent his final years in hiding, As a shadow ruler, he continued controlling his followers until he finally died in 1994. The organization eventually rebranded as the Family International. It continues to operate today under the leadership of Berg's widow, Karen Zerbe. Many of the children who grew up inside the system never left because they had no version of normal to return to. Decades after that first gathering on the beach, many survivors are still trying to piece together a life from the wreckage of Berg's vision. Burari Deaths. On the morning of July 1, 2018, Sant Nagar, Delhi felt like a neighborhood out of sync. Gurcharan Singh went for his usual walk, but his neighbor and buddy, Lalit Bhatia, wasn't waiting in their spot. The family grocery store was still shuttered at 7:15, while the Bhatias had opened at 5:30 a.m. every single day for decades. Gurcharan reached the Bhatia house, pushed open the unlocked front door, and walked into a scene that looked like a macabre art installation. 2 men, 6 women, and 2 teenagers were dangling together, their faces wrapped in cloth from a single bedsheet, ears stuffed with cotton, and mouths taped shut. In the next room, the 80-year-old grandma, Narayani Devi, lay strangled on the floor. The house was perfectly still. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing had been stolen, and CCTV showed no one had entered after 10 p.m. the night before. This was not a crime committed by a stranger. It was a voluntary family project that had been under construction for 11 years. It began in 2007 with the death of the patriarch, Bhopal Singh, a loss that shattered his youngest son, Lalit. Shortly after, Lalit told the family that his father's soul had moved into his body, effectively turning him into a meat puppet for Grandpa, who now dictated new rules for the household. The family didn't question this because they had seen a miracle with their own eyes. Lalit had been mute for years after a plywood accident, but his voice suddenly returned during a family prayer. To a grieving religious family, that was enough to accept Lalit as their prophet. From that point on, the family followed instructions that were recorded in diaries, slowly building toward a final ritual. They believed they were performing Bad Tapasya, the banyan tree rite, where they would hang like living roots as an act of devotion. At the very last second, Grandpa's spirit would appear and save everyone. They even kept a cup of water nearby, expecting it would change color the moment he arrived. On the night before they died, Lalit's wife, Tina, and his sister-in-law, Savita, went out to buy 5 stools, while Lalit's son, Shivam, and nephew, Dhruv, grabbed bundles of wire from the family store. Just 10 days earlier, they had hosted a joyful engagement party for Priyanka, masking everything behind normalcy. Instead of writing suicide notes, the family was soaking chickpeas for the next morning's meal and recharging their cell phones, fully expecting to be alive to use them. Grandpa never appeared. The water never changed. The only living thing left in the house was the family dog, found chained on a roof with a fever. Police rescued the animal and took him to a shelter, officially closing the case as a folie à famille, when one person loses their grip on reality and everyone who loves them follows them off the edge. Waco Sieg, 1993. Mount Carmel was a rural patch of Texas dirt where the only thing taller than the grass was the expectation of the apocalypse. Its story started in the 1930s when a Bulgarian immigrant named Victor Houteff decided the Seventh-day Adventist Church had gone soft and built a commune from nothing. When Victor died in 1955, his wife Florence took the wheel and immediately drove the movement into a ditch by promising the world would end in 1959. Most followers sold their earthly positions and waited for the fire. But when the sun rose on a perfectly normal 1960, the movement fractured into pieces. A loyalist named Benjamin Roden managed to sweep up the remaining believers and lead them for 20 years. But his death in 1978 left the group stuck with his son George, a man who possessed absolutely zero main character energy. By the early 1980s, the Branch Davidians were a community of professional anticipators, waiting for the end of the world and for a prophet who could finally explain the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation, which are the 7 passages in the Book of Revelation that, according to their belief, contained God's complete plan for the end of the world. Whoever could interpret them wasn't just a preacher, they were the chosen one. In 1981, a Houston kid named Vernon Wayne Howell walked in and filled the job description completely. School had been a nightmare for Vernon because of his dyslexia, but he had a freakish talent for memorizing entire chapters of scripture word for word. He began delivering massive, complex Bible interpretations that linked passages no one had ever thought to connect. To a group that had been starving for a sign, Vernon looked like the hand-picked choice of God. Vernon's rise to the top was a hostile takeover that involved a literal shootout with George Roden in 1987. Once the smoke cleared and the police were done making arrests, Vernon emerged as the undisputed alpha and rebranded himself as David Koresh. He took David from the biblical king and Koresh from the Hebrew name for Cyrus the Great, essentially naming himself God's chosen ruler. His followers didn't see the ego in the name change. Instead, they saw a Messiah who was finally answering their decades of prayer. With his authority absolute, Koresh immediately canceled every marriage in the compound, claiming that God wanted him to be the only one fathering a spiritual dynasty. He took multiple wives, many of them teenagers, convinced followers that questioning his bedroom habits was the same as questioning the Creator. While Koresh was busy building his House of David, the community was slowly turning Mount Carmel into a fortress. They stockpiled rifles, shotguns, and crates of ammunition, claiming they were just getting ready for the inevitable apocalypse. Federal agents suspected otherwise. Semi-automatic rifles fire 1 round per trigger pull. Fully automatic weapons keep firing as long as the trigger is held. Converting between the two is a federal crime, and the ATF believed Mount Carmel was doing exactly that. On February 28, 1993, the ATF attempted a dawn raid, but the Davidians had been tipped off and were waiting with their triggers pulled. When the shooting stopped, 4 federal agents and 6 Davidians were dead, and the botched raid turned into a national crisis that handed the keys over to the FBI. For the next 51 days, FBI negotiators tried to talk Koresh out of the building. A few children were released, but most of the adults refused to budge, because leaving the compound felt like resigning from heaven. On April 19, the feds lost their patience and sent armored vehicles to punch holes in the walls and pump the building full of tear gas. Fire swallowed the wooden structure. And despite the fact that the exits were wide open and the agents weren't blocking the doors, almost no one tried to escape. 76 bodies were found in the ashes, including 25 children and Koresh himself, who died from a gunshot to the head. It was a final grim proof of faith. Dozens of adults chose to burn alive rather than live in a world where Koresh wasn't the center of it. Anthill kids. In the late 1970s, a man named Roche Thériault from rural Quebec, Canada, decided that being a high school dropout and a failed door-to-door salesman was actually a qualification for divinity. After getting kicked out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1977 for being too radical, he reached the logical conclusion that heaven was under new management, and he was the CEO. He began scouting small towns across Quebec, pitching a pure life to families who were tired of the noise and pressure of modern civilization. He told them society was poison and that he was the only one who knew the way back to God. The message worked perfectly on people with hollow chests and nowhere else to go. Roche led his new followers into the deep wilderness, a settlement they called Eternal Mountain. The cluster of tiny cabins packed into the trees looked like an anthill, giving the group their name, the Anthill Kids. Life here was brutal by design, featuring 18-hour workdays and a total ban on alcohol, cigarettes, and television. While his followers were breaking their backs in the forest, Roche was spending his days drinking gallons of beer and claiming he was having divine visions that usually ended with him beating whoever was standing closest to him. To keep the ants in line, Roche introduced mandatory public confessions where every member had to announce their sins out loud in front of the group. Disobedience was handled with belts, fists, and a loyalty test that forced members to beat each other. Escape was technically possible, but physically suicidal. Leaving meant walking into the frozen Canadian wilderness with nothing. With that control secured, Roche expanded his power by declaring himself the father of a new spiritual bloodline, eventually fathering over 20 children with the women in the group. The cult moved from psychological abuse to a literal house of horrors when Roche announced that God had granted him power to heal the sick. Despite having zero medical training, he began performing surgeries on the dining room table using a toolkit that included pliers, meat cleavers, and a manual power drill. He decided that anesthesia and sterile equipment were unnecessary for a God-sent healer. One follower, Gabrielle Lavallee, underwent a spiritual cleansing that resulted in her right hand being removed with a meat cleaver. Others had holes drilled into their skulls because Roche decided that was the only way to evict the evil spirits living inside their heads. The violence eventually turned fatal, but even death couldn't break Roche's spell. When a 2-year-old boy named Samuel died from neglect and abuse, Roche attempted a resurrection that involved mutilating the toddler's body. When the prayers failed, he simply buried the child in the woods and went back to his beer. The breaking point finally came in 1989, when a follower named Solange Boyard developed stomach pain. A spectacularly drunk Roche sliced her open on the dining table with a kitchen knife. and she died under his care. One member managed to escape the compound after the murder and reached the authorities, leading to a police raid in November 1989. Roche Theriault was handed a life sentence in 1993 for second-degree murder and multiple counts of assault. He used conjugal visit laws to father even more children with women who remained devoted to his prophecies from behind bars. His reign finally ended on February 26, 2011, when a fellow inmate named Matthew Gerard MacDonald grew tired of the prophet's rhetoric during a heated argument. The man who spent years drilling holes in people's heads for purification died bleeding out on a prison floor after being stabbed with a homemade knife. Shinrikyo. 1980s Tokyo ran on ambition and exhaustion. High-flying professionals worked 12-hour days and lived entirely for deadlines, one bad Tuesday away from a total breakdown. For some of them, the answer came in the form of a yoga class taught by Chizuo Matsumoto. He's a nearly blind former acupuncturist who had already been fined by the government for selling fake remedies, but his claims of being the most important human alive impress anyway. By 1984, his Shibuya studio has mutated into a group called Shinrikyo, meaning Supreme Truth. Matsumoto has rebranded himself as Shoko Asahara. He says he's the first enlightened being since Buddha, capable of reading minds, surviving underwater for hours, and even levitating. Asahara connects his religious destiny to Isaac Asimov's Foundation sci-fi series and begins selling high-tech spiritual shortcuts. Followers happily pay a fortune to wear a helmet wired to sync their brain with his. For further spiritual elevation, the cult offers vials of Asahara's blood to drink, along with cups of his actual bathwater and baby batter. Business is so good that by 1989, the group secures official religious corporation status in Japan. The purity of the group is maintained through a violent internal logic that Asahara calls Poa. It is the belief that killing sinners is an act of mercy that bumps their souls upward before they can rack up more bad karma. When a devotee named Majima dies after being placed in scalding water for hours during thermal training, Asahara orders a full cover-up. When another member threatens to go to the police over the death, Asahara has him strangled. In 1989, a lawyer begins preparing a lawsuit against the cult. Asahara sends members to his home to make sure no one dares to challenge him again. They break in and kill the lawyer's entire family, including his 1-year-old son. They smash their teeth to block identification, then bury them in separate areas. Following this, Asahara attempts to take power legitimately by running for parliament in 1990 as the Truth Party. Despite using giant papier-mâché masks of his own face and playing cult anthems on street corners, the party loses the election. Undeterred by the ballot box, Asahara spends the early 1990s building a global terror network. It has 30,000 members in Russia and a private ranch in Australia. The cult buys a military helicopter, mines uranium for a failed nuclear bomb, and tests sarin gas on sheep. In Osaka, they carry out the first recorded human murder by VX nerve agent in history by sprinkling it onto the neck of a member Asahara labeled a spy. They attempted an anthrax attack in 1993, but it fails because they use a weakened vaccine strain. The next year, their chemists released sarin in Matsumoto City, killing 8 people. The police arrested a local man whose wife was in coma from the gas. Walks free and returns to the lab. The escalation reaches its peak on March 20, 1995. Asahara learns the police were planning to raid his compound. To distract them, he orders 5 members to drop newspaper-wrapped bags of liquid sarin on Tokyo's busiest subway lines during morning rush hour. They puncture the bags with umbrella tips. Thousands collapse on platforms, blinded and vomiting, while a station worker died clearing the leaking bags with his bare hands. 13 people were killed and over 5,500 were injured. The death toll would have been much higher if the sarin had been properly refined. At full purity, the same volume released in a confined space like a subway car can kill within minutes of exposure. The cult's batch was only 30% pure. 2 months later, police found Asahara hiding in a secret crawl space in his compound. After a 23-year trial, he and 12 followers were finally hanged on July 6, 2018. The group has since rebranded as Aleph. They continue to recruit young people through social media conspiracy theories and yoga classes. Order of the Solar Temple. On October 5, 1994, firefighters responding to a farmhouse fire in Sherry, Switzerland, broke inside and found a hidden underground chapel. 23 bodies were arranged in a perfect star formation. Red robes, black robes, plastic bags tied over heads. Most had been shot in the back of the skull. Their feet pointed toward a central altar. To understand how 74 wealthy professionals ended up dead across 3 countries, you have to go back 10 years. In 1984, Luc Juret, a Belgian homeopathic doctor, teamed up with French jeweler and professional fraud artist Joseph de Mombro in Switzerland. Together, they built a spiritual movement. Their recruits came from the upper ranks: doctors, civil servants, and business executives. The group presented itself as the spiritual successor to the Knights Templar, blending Egyptian mythology with New Age mysticism. At the center was the transit. They framed death as a passage, a soul flight to the star Sirius. To make that promise believable, de Mombro staged controlled miracles. Hidden speakers delivered divine voices. Lasers created glowing apparitions. The illusion held until 1994, when members began noticing the wires behind the magic. As doubt spread, de Mombro saw former members as a threat to the group's secrecy. Tony Dutoit became a target. He had a 3-month-old son, Christopher Emmanuel. De Mombro declared the infant the Antichrist. On September 30, 1994, cult members entered the Dutoit home posing as visitors. They took Tony to the basement and stabbed him over 50 times. His wife, Nikki, was killed the same way. The attack ended with a ritual. They drove a wooden stake through the infant's heart. Then they wrapped the bodies in plastic and hid them in a closet. Finally, they set a timed fire to erase the scene, but it failed. Neighbors saw the smoke and called the police, who discovered the bodies. On October 4 and 5, the mass executions began. In Sherry, Switzerland, police responded to a farmhouse fire and found a hidden underground chapel. Inside, 23 bodies lay in a star formation. They wore ceremonial red and black robes. Plastic bags covered their heads. Most had been shot in the back of the skull. Their feet pointed toward a central altar. That same night, another fire consumed a resort in Salvat. 25 more bodies were found. Among them were the group's leaders. Victims had been sedated before receiving lethal injections. The fire burned so intensely that identification required dental records. The movement continued beyond those sites. On December 16, 1995, 16 members gathered in a forest in France. 14 were drugged and shot. Their bodies were arranged in another star pattern and set on fire. The 2 executioners, a policeman and an architect, killed the others before shooting themselves. In March 1997, 5 more members in Quebec burned themselves to death. 3 teenagers survived because their parents negotiated their exclusion from the pact. In total, 74 people died chasing a promised passage to Sirius. Since most senior members died, no meaningful prosecution followed. Jonestown, People's Temple. In the 1950s, Jim Jones was a genuine Indiana civil rights hero who built a rare integrated church called the People's Temple. He preached apostolic socialism. It was a mix of the Bible and Karl Marx. Through the 1960s, the People's Temple expanded, drawing thousands of followers across California with its message of racial equality and social justice at a time when both were short in supply. By the 1970s, Jones had moved the operation to San Francisco. He became a political kingmaker so powerful that mayors and governors lined up to shake his hand and secure his massive block of guaranteed votes. As his influence grew, Jones leaned into deception to hold control. He healed followers by making them cough up fake tumors, actually chicken livers hidden in his sleeves. He claimed to be psychic, revealing secrets about followers that had been collected through internal surveillance. When journalists started asking questions about the staged miracles and missing funds, Jones moved nearly 1,000 followers into the Guyana jungle to build Jonestown. The promised utopia became a tropical labor camp where members worked 11-hour days in the heat for a bowl of rice and gravy. Jones kept everyone sleep deprived with non-stop propaganda over loudspeakers, often while heavily drugged. He took their passports and placed the settlement deep in the dense forest, making escape nearly impossible. Rule breakers were locked in the Learning Center, an underground box. At night, children were lowered into wells as adults made monster noises above. To maintain control, Jones staged White Nights, emergency drills where sirens blasted and he announced a fake CIA invasion. He handed out cups of poison and ordered everyone to drink, then revealed it was a loyalty test when no one died. He ran the drill multiple times over the following months. By November 1978, drinking on Jones's order was something the community had already practiced. As these drills conditioned the group, the camp doctor, Larry Schacht, began refining mass death logistics by testing cyanide doses on pigs and developing lethal mixtures. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan arrived with a film crew to investigate reports of abuse. During a staged, calm dinner, a member slipped a note to a reporter begging for help. That led 15 people to defect the next morning. When they reached the Port Kaituma airstrip, Jones's Red Brigade security team arrived in a tractor trailer and opened fire. Ryan was killed on the tarmac. He was the only U.S. congressman ever assassinated in office. Back at the compound, Jones announced the final white night. He claimed the military was coming to torture the adults and kidnap the children. Vats of grape flavor aid spiked with Shat cyanide mixture were brought to the pavilion. The 276 children were forced to drink first. Nurses used syringes to administer the poison to those who resisted. When Christine Miller, a member, stood up and suggested escape, Jones and the crowd shut her down. Within hours, 909 people lay dead in the clearing. Jones didn't drink the poison. He died from a single gunshot to the head. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe assisted. Nobody ever knew which. The Guyanese military found parents dead while holding their children, many of whom were hidden beneath the bodies of the adults. A few survivors managed to hide or escape into the jungle. They were later evacuated to the United States. Many spent decades dealing with trauma and public stigma.